Hello, friends, and welcome to History Happy Hour. My name is Dr. Colleen Shogan. I'm a Senior Vice President at the White House Historical Association and the Director of the David Rubenstein Center for White House History. Tonight, I'm excited to be joined by Ron White, the author of Lincoln in Private. This evening, Ron will join us and talk about his new book, which chronicles and discusses some of Lincoln's most private and intimate thoughts. Before I introduce Ron, however, let's start History Happy Hour as we always do with a drink. Fatima Butler, an award-winning mixologist and founder of Rooted in Hospitality in Chicago, joins us this evening to show us how to make the Lincoln 54 cocktail. Welcome to History Happy Hour, Fatima.
Hello, everyone. I am Fatima Butler from Chicago, Illinois. It's a pleasure to join you all for this happy hour. Today, I am making a cocktail in honor of Abraham Lincoln, and I am happy to hear more about Lincoln during this happy hour. Every ingredient in this cocktail in some way is related to Abraham Lincoln. And so let's get started. First, we have a little orgeat, which is almond liqueur. I'm going to put a ½ ounce of orgeat into this cocktail. Then we're going to add a little lemon juice. I'm going to put 3/4 of an ounce of lemon juice into this cocktail. Then we're going to add a little Laird's Applejack brandy, which is made in the United States. Add some ice. I'm gonna give it all a shake. So the almond almond syrup, it's like paying homage to Mary Todd. She was known for her almond cake. And so I thought, why not incorporate a little almond into this cocktail? Lincoln was known to not drink, to not imbibe, and therefore he would, at White House events, he would actually walk around with champagne and act as if he was drinking, but he never really drank it. So we top it off with a little champagne. Then we're going to add to that an orange twist. Cheers.
Cheers, Fatima. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Before I introduce Ron, I want to remind you that if you have questions for Ron at the end of our program, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just type in your question, your first name, and where you're watching the program from this evening, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. And now I'm honored to welcome Ron White back to History Happy Hour. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ron because he has so many books. We're, of course, talking about Lincoln in Private tonight, but he's also the author of a New York Times bestseller, A Lincoln, a Biography. He is the author of Lincoln's Greatest Speech, a New York Times notable book, and The Eloquent President, a Los Angeles Times bestseller. A second presidential biography, American Ulysses, won the 2017 William Henry Seward Award for Excellence in Civil War Biography. Ron is a graduate of UCLA, of the Princeton Theological Seminary, and he received a PhD in religion and history from Princeton University. So welcome, Ron, again to History Happy Hour, and we're so excited to talk to you about this new book.
Thank you, Colleen. I think it's the third time we've been talking with each other, and I'm delighted.
Yes, absolutely. So Ron, in this book, you provide an in-depth examination of Lincoln's private notes, sometimes called to or referred to as fragments. that he really wrote throughout his life. Can you explain to our viewers what these notes were and why they are so important to understanding Lincoln?
Let me share a Lincoln story. It was the spring of 1863. The war was not going well for the North or the Union. Lincoln faced a variety of critics. Some of those critics were peace Democrats called Copperheads, and they were holding rallies around the nation criticizing Lincoln because the war was being called now Mr. Lincoln's War. They met in Albany, New York, and drafted what they called 10 Albany Resolves. They sent them to Lincoln and dared him to write a reply to them. He sat down in his office, and as he began to write, an Iowa congressman, James Wilson, entered. He saw Lincoln writing, and he said, "Mike, this is amazing. You can sit down at your desk and write from scratch one of your remarkable letters?" And Lincoln said, "Oh, no." He said, "It's all over there." And he pointed to an open drawer in his desk. "It's all over there in disconnected thoughts. I keep them there in scraps of paper. I don't want any of those ideas to escape me." They've escaped us. That's the whole purpose of the book. Lincoln wrote these notes. He never dated them, never titled them, never signed them, never expected us to see them. I contacted Colleen, the Lincoln Papers Project in Springfield, and I said, "Well, how many notes do we have?" They said, "Well, we believe that we have 111 surviving notes." I think he wrote hundreds more. So out of the 111, which are all published in the book, I chose 12 to write about in 10 chapters. I think some of the most significant and interesting notes that reveal things about Lincoln, the private Lincoln, that we probably didn't know in the public Lincoln.
So let's start out with the first note that you actually write about in your book, which is about a 1848 family trip to Niagara Falls that Lincoln takes. It's a very unusual note because of its very descriptive, very ornate language. What does that reveal to us about Lincoln?
Well, I wanted to see whether these notes might show us a different side of Lincoln. Lincoln is often seen, as he is, very rational, very logical, very deductive in his reasoning. Here we encounter a poetic Lincoln, a very lyrical Lincoln. Let me just read the last paragraph of this particular note. "But there is still more. Niagara Falls calls up the indefinite past, when Columbus first sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his maker, then as now, Niagara was roaring here. The eyes of that species of gentle extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do. Contemporary with the whole race of men and older than the first men, Niagara is strong and fresh today as 10,000 years ago. The mammoth and the mastodon, now so long dead, that fragments of their monstrous bones alone testify that they ever lived, have gazed on Niagara. In that long, long time, never still for a single moment, never dried, never froze, never slept, never rested," but he ends with a comma. And so these notes were originally called by his secretaries, who found them after his death, fragments, because Lincoln will often end in the middle of a sentence. It's like you and I, Colleen, would be called away. We've written a note and we don't complete it. And so these are just fascinating, these fragments.
An 1854 fragment or note that you include in the book about slavery, I think is really instructive. And we're actually going to put it up here on screen. And we're so used to thinking about Lincoln and his conceptions of slavery, particularly as he progresses in his political career, thinking about slavery in moral terms. But he doesn't think about slavery in moral terms in this note. He's using actually logic or rationality to try to think through the issue of slavery. Can you talk us through this note and explain to us why he might have written it at this time?
Yes, let's refresh our memory. Lincoln serves 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, 1 term in Congress, 1847 to 49. He takes a stand against America's war with Mexico, comes home. Many people believe he'd been traitorous to the then President James Polk, and decides to become a full-time lawyer, which he is for 5 years. But in 1854, you see the date of this note with a question mark, Lincoln comes right back into the political fray because the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed. This act will allow slavery to expand into the Western territories, Kansas and Nebraska. So before Lincoln gives any formal speech, I say he holds his fire, he writes these notes to himself. And I find this one most remarkable. I said 111 were at Springfield, actually 110 are at Springfield. This note is held in possession of Harlan Crow, a remarkable person in Dallas, Texas, who has his own private library and his own curator. And Mr. Crow has allowed me to use this note in my book. Let's read it. Think about it. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may of right enslave B, why may not B snatch the same argument and prove equally that he may enslave A? You say A is white and B is black. It is color then, the lighter, having the right to enslave the darker. Take care. By this rule, you are to be a slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. Oh, you do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually the superior to blacks, and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to be slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But say you, it's a question of interest. And if you can make it your interest, you have the right to enslave another. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, he has the right to enslave you. Colleen, what I see here in part is Lincoln the lawyer taking the other side of the argument, taking the pro-slavery side, and one by one, he overturns this argument. He never uses these words in any public speech. I say he's using them to help himself think about the meaning and the problem of slavery.
Lincoln also provides in another one of the notes, one of the most succinct definitions of democracy I think that I've ever read. If we can also bring that up. It's only 33 words, but we learn about what Lincoln thinks about democracy and also what he thinks it's not. So what can we learn from Lincoln just from this very, very short definition of how he conceives democracy at this time?
What I try to do in the book is to put the context to these notes. I said that his secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, discovered them in his office. They didn't discover this one. Mary Lincoln, who's come under bad press of late, I'm more sympathetic to her. She lost one son in 1850, a second son in 1862, her husband by assassination, and then the third son in the late 1860s. She gave this note to a person, a first female lawyer who helped her get release from an insane asylum where she was consigned in 1875. We don't really know the date of this note. The editors suggest 1858. Well, let's take that date. Yes, as you suggest, this is so brief, but let's read it out loud. As I would not be a slave, the italics is really a word that Lincoln underlines, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Let me just make a comment. Lincoln early on understood the evils of slavery. As a 19-year-old, he was asked to take a load of produce by boat down to New Orleans. And there he was aghast when he saw men standing on one side of the Mississippi, women on the other. Marriage was not recognized among slaves. He knew that they would be sold off to different places. But slowly he came to the understanding that slavery is not just bad for the slave, it's bad for the master. It's bad for white people too. And one other thing, let me point out, Lincoln was a master of what he called the negative. I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Remember in the Gettysburg Address, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here. In one sentence, Lincoln was pretty wordy as a young man. Maybe we are all wordy when we're young, but he learned to be very brief and very succinct in his definitions as he grew in experience.
So, Ron, why rhetorically did Lincoln use negatives? Why do you think that was something that he resorted to in a lot of his well-known writings? I really wonder about that.
Well, Lincoln is a master of contrast. Yes and no. Again, this is, I think, part of his lawyerly training. You have to understand the other side before you can present your own. So we may not think of this as so powerful, but Lincoln uses the negative again and again and again to sort of highlight the difference. That's what he's doing here. It would be one thing if he just simply said democracy is, okay, got it. But when he says democracy is not, that highlights for him what it really is all about.
Okay. Thank you. Now, in another note, Lincoln talks about the Declaration and the Constitution, and he says the Declaration of Independence is the apple of gold, and it's encased by this silver frame around it, which is the Constitution. And I remember I learned this in a college course in American political thought. I never forgot it. But it turns out it's really important for our understanding of Lincoln and also for our understanding of our founding documents as citizens. So can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, here's a note that again speaks to Lincoln's genius. He's elected president, November 1860. He's worried about the South, but he hears that his former colleague in Congress, Alexander Stephens, is against secession in Georgia. Stephens will ultimately become the vice president of the Confederacy. So he writes to Stephens and he says, well, I would love to hear what you said in your address. And if you want to write me a letter, I'd like to get that too. And Stephens is the one who uses this incredible phrase, apples of gold. It's from the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. And what's remarkable here is that Lincoln takes Stephens' metaphor and turns it around to suggest that the real basis of our society is the Declaration of Independence. Yes, the Constitution is important, but underneath the Constitution and before the Constitution, this is the apple of gold. And this is the whole basis by which he re-enters the political fray. All men are created equal. That's the premise of the Declaration. And in responding to Stephens, he says, this is what our nation is all about.
Our last question before we go, and I know we're going to have a lot of audience questions for you this evening, Ron, is probably about the most famous Lincoln note or fragment, which has been titled over time as the Meditation on the Divine Will. We're going to bring it up on screen here and we can talk through it. It's a really important statement of Lincoln's political thought. It's the basis of one of the main arguments in the second inaugural. So can you talk a little bit about how Lincoln is working through the role of God in the Civil War and how that ultimately affects how Lincoln thinks about the Civil War as a turning point in American history?
Yes, Colleen, let's refresh again our kind of memory of Lincoln's life. Born in 1809 in Kentucky, moving with his parents to Indiana as a young boy, then to Illinois, where he lives first in New Salem, then in Springfield. He does what many people then and now do. He rejects the faith of his parents, a very emotional faith, part of what we call the Second Great Awakening. They attended Baptist churches in Kentucky and Indiana. He becomes really an infidel by the term of the 19th century, but then happens to Lincoln, it may happen to us. Life tumbles in. Eddie dies in 1850, 3.5 years old. Willie dies in 1862, 11 years old. Lincoln is now struggling with the meaning of the Civil War, and in August of 1862, the North loses yet one more battle, the Second Battle of Bull Run, or the Second Battle of Manassas. Lincoln convenes an emergency cabinet meeting. I'm so happy that 3 of his secretaries kept diaries. One of them, the Attorney General, writes in his diary, he said, Lincoln said to us this day, he was distraught with the bitterest of anguish. He felt almost like hanging himself. And then we think, the editors believe, he sat down that afternoon and wrote this document. It's only 9 sentences. Let's read it. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. Do you hear the logical Lincoln in that sentence? And then this profound sentence, in the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. People were coming to Lincoln to say, God is on our side. He knew they were coming to Jefferson Davis to say, God is on our side. And yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end yet by his mere quiet power. Lincoln didn't like the noisy God of his youth. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. Yet the contest proceeds. Colleen, when I wrote my first Lincoln book on his second inaugural address, in which he mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times, some of the critics said, oh, well, Lincoln is simply doing what his audience was doing. He's quoting their words. He may not even be sincere. He's just very shrewd in picking up the language of a religious people. But nobody knew at that day that 2.5 years earlier, he had written this document for his eyes only. And look at what he says at the end. He could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest, and having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day. What do you mean, either side? He's the commander-in-chief. He's supposed to be winning this war for the Union. This is why these notes are so important. They reflect a side of Lincoln that is not seen in the public Lincoln and not seen in the traditional biographies of Lincoln.
Absolutely. So we have some questions, and if you have any, please put them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many as possible. Tom from Evanston, Illinois asks, during your research, did you ever come across a note which, when compared to another note or a public speech, showed an evolution or a change in Lincoln's thinking about an important issue?
Thank you, Tom. That's a good question. I like Evanston, Illinois. I was a freshman at Northwestern. Well, what surprised me, Tom, was that actually very few of these notes do appear in public speeches, but there are a few that do. And really, to take your suggestion, you can see an evolution. The notes are often quite brief. The speeches are often quite long, but you can see what I would call the bones of the speech in the notes that Lincoln has written previously to himself.
Heidi asks, didn't Lincoln mention God much more frequently after he became president? And did he have much to say rhetorically about Christianity? So Christianity being, distinct from just mentions of God.
Yes, that's a very good comment. You are correct. He did mention God more as president. This is why his law partner, William Herndon, who would go around the country after Lincoln's death saying, well, Lincoln was not a religious person. Herndon didn't know the Lincoln of the White House. And why did he do so? I argue that the missing person in the Lincoln story is Phineas Densmore Gurley, the minister of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, which Lincoln attended more and more frequently. So when we get to the second inaugural, for example, the language is all about providence. That's what Gurley was preaching. We have Gurley's sermons at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. So yes, he does mention him more, but people were still surprised at the second inaugural. He had never mentioned God so completely as he did in that address. Someone asked me last week, what would I do if I had dinner with him next week? I'd say, well, what might you have said in your second term?
A good question from Oliver. Sometimes we have from Chelsea, Massachusetts. Sometimes we have good historical questions about methodology. And he'd like to know, how are you able to estimate the date of some of these undated notes?
Oliver, that's an excellent question. If you decide to purchase the book, you will see that many of the dates are followed by a question mark. So Hay and Nicolay were the first biographers, the first to write the complete works of Lincoln, to edit them. They gave their estimation. Roy Basler, did a 9-volume with 2 supplemental volumes in the 1950s. He estimates his dates. For the most part, I accept those dates. In several of them, I suggest, no, I think maybe there's a different date. But we're never quite sure because Lincoln did not date these notes.
Ron, why do you think that Lincoln wrote these notes in literally paper fragments? Why didn't he collect them in some sort of, a journal or book or something that was bound together? Why were these pieces of paper sort of scattered all about?
That's an excellent question. The President Lincoln had an African-American servant who would sit with him often in the evening while Lincoln was reading. And the servant told us that he watched Lincoln, and Lincoln would take little pieces of paper and write down things on them from the newspapers or the books he was reading and stuff them in his pockets. So I don't quite know why he didn't do that. Wouldn't it have been nice if he'd been more organized? But that's what makes it so fascinating to find. And you will see that these notes, and I give so much credit to our publisher, Random House, they're printed in color in the middle of this book. It's really remarkable to see these notes in color.
That's right. I mean, the layout of the book is excellent. And as we were remarking before History Happy Hour started, Lincoln's writing, his penmanship is actually quite good. So you can actually read Lincoln's notes in his own handwriting with, relative ease because of how they're printed in the book. A question from Nancy, and this is a favorite topic of a lot of our History Happy Hour viewers, which is First Ladies. Can you give us your view, and I know you have one, on whether Mary Lincoln was a support to Lincoln? Did he depend on her, or did she depend upon him, or was it both?
Well, as I said a little bit earlier, I'm a little more positive about Mary Lincoln than many people. Remember, she had quite a good education for a girl of her time. She was better educated than he was in terms of formally. She was his champion in Springfield. She saw early on his great potential. She was a confidant of him. Who can get into whether it was a rocky marriage or not? That's not my point. I think this is who she was. She then struggled when she came to Washington because the women of Washington treated her as kind of a Western rube. The West would have been Illinois. And then she was in many ways replaced as a confidant or a counselor by William Seward and by the persons in his cabinet. But I think she was a very important person in his life, who he became.
A question from Bill. Do Lincoln's notes indicate anywhere where what he would have done or what would have been his most important work had he been able to live to execute his second term of office?
Yes, Bill, the notes that occur while he's president are printed, and they are dated. And we know before the notes, but also the notes concur with this, as early as 1863, Lincoln was thinking about Reconstruction. He was suggesting that if the state of Louisiana, for example, if just 10% of the voters there would be willing to accept the Union, they would be able to come back in. So what really surprised me in writing my biography of Lincoln was that many of Lincoln's partners, so to speak, in the Republican Congress thought he was much too soft. And when he died, some of them, this is hard to believe, were really almost relieved because they wanted to punish the South. And they didn't want Lincoln to be so reconciling, so magnanimous towards the South. Because yes, he was thinking about Reconstruction, and you can see some of this in his notes from the White House.
The next question is from Robert, and he asks one of my favorite questions that we've talked about before. He says, Ron, you wrote a great book on Ulysses S. Grant, and you can often tell a lot about someone concerning their relationship that they have with others. What does Grant's relationship with Lincoln tell us about these two men?
That's a wonderful comment. Thank you so much for that. Yes, I was impressed in reading and writing about Grant, of Grant's great admiration for Lincoln. I mean, Grant becomes president. He writes these remarkable memoirs, but in his memoirs, he said, there's no one that can compare with Abraham Lincoln. He never compared himself to him. But the two had what I call a mutual admiration society. Both were from the West. Both were humble, ambitious, but humble. Grant never asked for more than Lincoln could give him. Grant never overstated the opponent's advantage or numbers. And so Lincoln had a huge admiration for Grant, and Grant had this great admiration for Lincoln. Two persons really cut in some ways from the same cloth.
Kathleen asks about the Gettysburg Address, and she says, "Isn't this why, given the idea that Lincoln calls the Declaration the apple of gold, isn't this why the Gettysburg Address starts 407 years ago, looking back at the Declaration and not the Constitution?" Can you remark?
Excellent. You're absolutely correct. In 272 words, this is the whole point of the address. And this really is the foundation of the Gettysburg Address. And you're absolutely correct in saying that statement. This had become Lincoln's leitmotif from 1854 forward, even more important as he tried to understand the meaning of the Union, and therefore ultimately the meaning of we need a new birth of freedom.
A question from Mary, and I know we have a new exhibit at Lincoln's Cottage, which is at the Soldiers' Home in Washington, D.C. And she wants to know if you know anything about Lincoln's Cottage. She would like to travel there and visit it, and if you could talk about its significance at all.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, I was privileged to be visiting Lincoln's Cottage as it was being built. And Aaron Mast, who became the director of the Lincoln Cottage, is now the executive director of the Abraham Lincoln Library in Springfield, just appointed 6 months ago. And it's a wonderful place to visit because it's one of these new kinds of museums where you're not pressing your nose against the wall to look at some document, but you're sitting in a room and suddenly it's like Lincoln is there with you. Lincoln would spend 3, 4, 5 months a year there. It's only 3.5 miles from the White House, but he did some of his most important thinking. I'm sure he wrote his notes there. This is where he wrote the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. So although it's not always an easy place, even for taxis to find, I think that this is a place people should visit when they come to Washington.
A question from Kathy, and she wants to know about the framed picture you have of Abraham Lincoln behind you. If you can tell us what that is.
Well, that framed picture is the wonderful gift 9 years ago, no, not 9 years ago, 2009, of my publicist at Random House. Abraham Lincoln made it onto the New York Times best-selling list. And so that is the New York Times best-selling list with a portrait of Lincoln.
Terrific. A question from Amar. Can you talk a little bit about Lincoln's chronicled depression? How did that impact his presidency? And also maybe is that revealed at all in any of his writings or notes that you have in your recent book?
Yes, Joshua Schenck has written a wonderful book called Lincoln's Melancholy. Early on, when I would speak to Lincoln, 2 different events, I met 2 different psychiatrists. And they explained to me what we would now call Lincoln's depression. I think it afflicted him much more as a younger man than an older man. And the 2 psychiatrists independently said people respond to melancholy or depression in different ways. You could say, oh, poor me, which would be understandable, or you could also learn from it. And they both said sometimes depression is actually the deep feelings of people for their own pain, but also the pain of others. And I think Lincoln, in a certain sense, if this is the right use of words, used his depression to become a more feeling person towards others. I do not think it affected him when he was president of the United States.
A question from Bruce. Were there any notes about his personal feelings about his generals and the way that the war was going?
Good question, Bruce. The question I'm often asked is, why didn't he get rid of McClellan sooner? There are notes about military strategy, but no notes that are critical of generals. But this raises a larger issue. What happened to the other notes? Mary Lincoln, when they were getting ready to leave Springfield in February 1861 to go to Washington, burned most all of her letters. in what she called her burn pile. People in the 19th century did this. They didn't want people to read letters between husbands and wives, so they burned the correspondence. Did Lincoln burn any of these notes? This was, of course, before his presidency. Or Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son, became the custodian of these papers. He might have thought, well, I don't think we want to have Lincoln's words about McClellan or anybody else. He was really watching closely when Hay and Nicolay wrote their biography. He wanted to be sure the best part of his father came forward. It's possible that he deleted, so to speak, some of the notes that were in Lincoln's handwriting.
A question from Robert. Did any of the notes give any indication of his thoughts about how the freed slaves would live following the war, about the future of the enslaved people?
They do not. Lincoln was hopeful about that. Grant took up his command, to give the freed people their rights, which became the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. If you saw the movie Lincoln, you saw Lincoln's great championing of the 13th Amendment. He won the decisive election in November of 1864. Congress only met in winter months. These people went back to their farms and towns, and people said, well, just wait till Congress reconvenes next December, 12 months from now. Lincoln says, no, I'm not going to wait. We're going to get this 13th Amendment passed. So we know Lincoln's strong feeling about giving freedom to the slaves, but we don't see too much of that in the notes. We see a lot, which I've just read today, about his feelings about slavery, but not so much after the war.
A question from a few people, and I think this is, this puts Lincoln a little bit more of contemporary context. Did Lincoln ever use a speechwriter or a wordsmith, or does everything that we read from Lincoln, his speeches, in his own writing, himself?
A good question. Really, there's no presidential speechwriter until we get to FDR. That's when it all begins. And today we just take it for granted that presidents who have to give far, far more speeches, that there are speechwriters. So Lincoln did this in his own hand, but what I want to emphasize, and I love to emphasize this to students, is there's no such thing as great writing, there's only great rewriting. In my book, The Eloquent President, I give you several versions or drafts of his key speeches. Lincoln was a rewriter. He was an editor of his own words.
A question from Virginia. If President Lincoln was alive today, what advice do you think he would give to a divided America?
Well, you were nice in asking that question. I did my first in-person event on Tuesday at the California Club in Los Angeles, and the first question was, what would Lincoln think of today's GOP? And I kind of paused. Well, I think first of all, he would want us to be much more respectful of each other, to not question each other's motives, to assume and recognize and acknowledge all of us love our country. All of us are patriots. Now, then we can disagree with each other in terms of policy. That's perfectly fine. But the idea of sort of trashing each other's motives, Lincoln would be aghast at that. I mean, he disagreed strongly with Stephen Douglas, but he never said that Stephen Douglas was not patriotic. In fact, at the beginning of one of his debates, he says, I do not question Mr. Douglas's patriotic motives. So that's something he could bequeath to us today.
And in actually one of the notes in your book talks about Lincoln's a little bit his uneasy relationship at first, obviously, with the Republican Party, because Lincoln was a Whig. He only came to the Republican Party as his hand was being forced and for political necessity, correct?
That's right. And so again, I think as a lawyer, he recognizes that there are critics of the new Republican Party, and one of the main criticism is that it's a sectional party. The Whig Party had been a national party.
Right.
Because the Republican Party really is basically an anti-slavery party. So he takes pains in two of the notes really to sort of say, we have to answer this question. It isn't really a sectional party, it's dealing with national issues.
A good question from William in North Carolina. What are the sources or the foundations of Lincoln's eloquence? What did he read to help mold him?
Wonderful question, William. First of all, we need to understand the way grammar was taught in the 19th century. Uh, Lincoln read a grammar book at age 23, if you can believe that. The book in its preface says this book is for juveniles. I'd love to have juveniles read this book today. Half of the book, William, was what was then called declamation. Declamation. People were given passages from the Bible, from Shakespeare, from Lord Byron to read out loud. And so I think Lincoln understood early on that compared to his peers who were lawyers, who had fought in the Black Hawk War in Illinois, he could rise by the gift of public speaking. And in one of the fragments, which is a notes for a lecture to lawyers, he talks about the fact that the lawyer, if he is going to advance, must develop the capacity for public speaking. Sadly, I think in our world, public speech has been relegated to, at best, an elective course. I was thinking about my own high school experience. Speech was required of every single person. I think we're losing something as it's just become an elective.
That's true. I had to take public speaking as well, and I'm actually really glad that I did. Question from Jonathan. He says that Lincoln he sees a lot of similarities between Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill for many of the things that you've mentioned here today. Great eloquence, great speaking abilities, political skills. Do you see that similarity between Lincoln and Churchill?
Yes, that's an excellent comparison. I've often said that each person led their nation through the Civil War and then Churchill through World War II by their eloquence, by the gift of public speaking. Now, their speaking was completely different. I mean, Churchill was the recipient of a fine private school education in Great Britain. His speeches were often quite long, but yet both mastered the ability to use the right metaphor. Both worked long and hard over their speeches, both edited their speeches, both were good speakers in terms of just eloquence of speaking. So I think the best comparison in many ways would be Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill, two great speakers.
Our last question tonight comes from Carolyn from Australia. And I think she asked a really important question for the future. In this day of digital electronic communication, digital communication, how will this impact the future historians for the ability to find hidden gems in drawers like you did with Lincoln's private notes?
That's a marvelous, marvelous question. The dilemma of finding more notes is they're not titled, dated, or signed. Believe it or not, we've actually found some Lincoln letters in the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Someone will find from their great grandfather tucked away in an attic, and they'll bring it to the Library of Congress or the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, and it will be genuine. But the idea of possibly finding these notes, if you saw something like this, unless you really knew Lincoln's handwriting, I'm worried it wouldn't come forward. If I could flip that question a little bit, you didn't exactly ask this, but I'm going to take advantage of your question anyway. I like to speak to high school students. I've done it all across this country, from Massachusetts to Hawaii, and I'll often ask the high school students, how long did it take Lincoln to write these notes? And invariably, they'll say 3 minutes, 4 minutes, and I'll pause and smile and say, how about 30 minutes or an hour? What Lincoln is doing here is interesting for us. Are we willing and able, with our screens, with our distractions, to take the time to think deeply about the issues of our day and then write notes to ourselves, write letters, actual letters to people? I've now learned I shouldn't just send my quick email. I'm starting to write my things on a Word document, edit it a little bit, think about it, and then copy it to an email. This is what Lincoln is doing here. He is so wonderful with words. He's a great example to us.
Well, Ron, thank you so much for joining us this evening. The book again, and I have it right here, is Lincoln in Private. And we absolutely wish you well with it. And thank you for coming back and joining us for History Happy Hour. Thank you again also to Fatima Butler for presenting that great cocktail, the Lincoln 54. We hope you'll join us for our next History Happy Hour, which will be on June 3rd. My colleague, White House Historical Association Vice President of Development, Rhett Wilson, will be joined by Melody Barnes, the co-director for Policy and Public Affairs at the University of Virginia's Democracy Initiative. She previously served as a domestic policy advisor in the Obama White House. They will discuss Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Thank you and good night.